A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger Rebbe.
For the 11 prolific team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Schon 1000 Shabbos at the Skitzal.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little. It is never too late. And it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide,
Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode about Rav Yehuda Aszod has been generously sponsored. L'zecher Nishmas Rav Yehuda Aszod, may he continue to be a Meilitz Yesher for his entire family, for bracha, nachas, shidduchim, and refuas, especially for Chaim Shol ben Pesel, should have a refuah shalema as well. One of the most famous things about Rabbi Yehuda Aszod is the picture that's taken of him, which supposedly, and this is a legend which actually might be true, I wasn't able to fully verify it. The more I looked into it, the more it seems like that it's a consensus that this is one of those legends that might actually be a true one. So if it is, that's wild. If it's not, it's, also wild. So that they took a picture of him post-mortem. After he had already passed away, they propped him up in a chair, they dressed him in his Shabbos clothing, put a sefer in his arms, and they take a picture of him for posterity, which hung in the homes of every good, upstanding Hungarian Jew until the Holocaust. The funds that they were able to raise from selling this picture, they used to marry off the the youngest daughter, I think was the only one not married, of Rabbi Yehuda Aszod. So they were able to use it as a good fundraiser also. And this was a picture they took of him after he had already passed away. That's probably the most famous thing that even people who are not familiar with his life and accomplishments, they have heard of him. But he was really quite an accomplished figure. He was a rabbi, a paisik, a rosh yeshiva, and one of the most influential leaders of Hungarian Orthodoxy of the 19th century. The story of the development of Hungarian Orthodoxy is such a fascinating one, and a profile of Rabbi Yehuda Aszod's life can actually be seen in a context, in this context, as a chapter in its development, with the Ksav Sofer, of course, as the founder, then also the Maharam Banet, who the latter was Rabbi Yehuda Aszod's primary teacher, and the former, the Ksav Sofer, was someone who he developed a very warm relationship with later on in life. And it was the Ksav Sofer's students who had a decisive and long-lasting impact on Hungarian Orthodoxy, whose reverberations are still with us today in today's Orthodox society in the United States and Israel. So Rabbi Yehuda Aszod, who was not a student of the Ksav Sofer, he interacted with all of these parties that I just mentioned, and he therefore can justifiably be viewed as one of the architects of Hungarian Orthodoxy. You have to understand that Hungary was a province in the Austrian Empire at this time. It only becomes a unified double capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire after the passing of Rabbi Yehuda Aszod. At this point, it's the Austrian Empire. It's post-Napoleon, which is important because they're on the road to emancipation. The Jews are lobbying for emancipation. There's already the reform movement in Germany, and a similar movement is already developing in Hungary as well. And that's the challenge, is that the Ksav Sofer, that the Maharam Banet, and especially his student Rabbi Yehuda Aszod, is faced with and is confronting on a regular basis. And the geographical borders of Hungary are not what modern Hungary is today, because it's within the Austrian Empire, and many areas are considered Hungarian areas, including places that are part of the Czech Republic, of Slovakia, Romania today. It was considered of the greater Hungarian area. And of course we have the divide within Jewish Hungary between Oberland and Unterland. The Oberland is the Yeki German Jews who arrive from the west and they migrate east, and that's that culture and value system. Whereas Unterland is primarily immigrants from Galicia and Ukraine and is much more Hasidic. And that's two communities, and they're both relatively new communities, and Hungarian Jewry as a whole is relatively new. It's from primarily its development in the 1700s, although there is an ancient community from much earlier. And the Ksav Sofer and his influence on the development of basically the Oberland part of that community is the decisive factor that Rav Yehuda Aszod, though he is not a student of his, but this is the world that he's operating in. Of course, the Ksav Sofer and his influence needs its own series, which hopefully we'll have one day. It's incredible that we're this far into Jewish history soundbites, and we have yet to cover a full series on the Ksav Sofer and his tremendous impact on the Orthodox world. So it's into this world of the 18th and 19th century that Rav Yehuda Aszod is born into and grows up, and he's born in 1794 to a simple family, not from a great rabbinic background, in the small Hungarian town of Aszod or Aszod, which is where he gets his name from. It's near Budapest in Hungary. That's Hungary proper, not Unterland. This is real heavy Oberland. He's orphaned at a young age of his father. His mother, with great sacrifice, sends him off to study in yeshiva in several places. The Hungarian yeshiva model, which again, the Ksav Sofer is one of the architects of that, although there were yeshivas even before him. But it was quite different in substance and in structure from the yeshivas in Poland, Lithuania, Russia. A completely different story, which I think I've touched on in earlier episodes. One of the major differences, for instance, it's worth pointing out, is the rather bizarre and troubling fundraising system employed in Hungarian yeshivas, in which the young teenage yeshiva students would use their summer vacation and other times to canvass villages and shtetls around the countryside, fundraising for their yeshiva, essentially begging for their yeshiva, which is an interesting practice. Either way, so he has to engage in that practice as well. Rav Yehuda Aszod, he first studies in a yeshiva in Dunaszerdahely, which I'm going to get back to. It's the town that features prominently in his life, throughout his life, at several stages, and it's under the tutelage at that point of Reb Aaron Bichler. From there, he moves on to the greatest, probably the greatest, or one of the greatest yeshivas in Central Europe, in Nikolsburg, where he emerges as a prime and favorite disciple of one of the most influential rabbis of the era in that part of the world, Rav Mordechai Banet, the Maharam Banet. He's the rabbi of Nikolsburg, the chief rabbi of Moravia, and he also has this large yeshiva. We go to his grave in Nikolsburg. Maharam Banet, I was just there a few weeks ago with a group. Rabbi Shmelk of Nikolsburg is there, and the Tzemach Tzedek, who's the Rav of Nikolsburg, is there. So he's there prominently as well. Maharam Banet, once we mentioned him, he was a student of the Noda B'Yehuda and primarily a student of Rabbi Shmuel Shmelka of Nikolsburg, which is interesting because he was a Talmudic student of his. He never really became a chassid. Either way, he succeeded, Maharam Banet succeeds Reb Shmelk of Nikolsburg as the rabbi of Nikolsburg upon his passing in 1789, and he remains there as the rabbi for the next 40 years until his passing. In the yeshiva that he leads, which Rav Yehuda Aszod now comes to study in, at its peak, were 400 students at this yeshiva. Maharam Banet was very influential in the public sphere. He partners with the Ksav Sofer on several occasions on issues of public policy and confronting the challenges of modernity and reform in both Germany and in Hungary. He was very influential, left a long-lasting impact on Hungarian Orthodoxy, and that's who Rabbi Yehuda Aszod becomes a talmid of, a student of, and he's a favorite of his while studying in the yeshiva. He was there for 4 years. The Maharam Banet also looked after him since he was an orphan. In Poland and Lithuania and Russia and yeshivas, the eating system of yeshiva students was referred to as teg, essen teg, eating a daily meal by the townspeople's homes. Of course, you leave it to the Hungarians to have a different term for it. Over there it was called kostaj or kostaj. I'm not sure the Hungarian pronunciation. They didn't use Yiddish so much in these parts. It was more German or Hungarian. And that's what Rav Yehuda Aszod had to do. He had to find his meals there. It was especially challenging for him. He was one of the poorest students in the yeshiva. The young Rav Yehuda Aszod once saved up some money and bought his own set of daled minim for Sukkot, lulav and esrig, but he could not afford a new pair of shoes. He had torn shoes, and this contrast of this young yeshiva student walking around with his own set of daled minim and yet having torn shoes was someone that everyone noticed and remembered, and as a result, people started to nickname him the Pantoffelbacher, which means the boy with the slippers. The Maharam Banet appointed him to deliver a shir to a group of younger students in the yeshiva. He held him in very high esteem as one of his star pupils. He defended him against some jealous students at the yeshiva who attempted to take him down. You're talking about students of the Maharam Banet in one of the premier yeshivas in Central Europe, and yeah, these activities took place in the yeshiva as well. But either way, the Maharam Banet defended him. And once someone overheard the Maharam Banet preparing his Shabbos Hagadol speech, and he was saying out loud, so what if my student Yehuda asks this question, then I'll have to answer it in this fashion. In other words, part of his preparation for his Shabbos Hagadol drasha was actually anticipating his young students' questions and how he's going to answer the problems that he poses to him during the speech. That's the esteem that the Maharam Banet held for Rav Yehuda Aszod at this young age. He receives his rabbinical ordination from Rav Mordechai Banet, and at the age of 22, he marries his wife, who is from this town that he had previously studied in, Dunaszerdahely, and he settles there, eventually being appointed as a dayan in the local rabbinical court. And now that he was in the rabbinate, he started to have an affiliation with the Ksav Sofer, who of course was the biggest rabbi in the area, which is especially true following the passing of his teacher, the Maharam Banet. He got even closer with the Ksav Sofer, and also because his first rabbinical posting, he became the rabbi of the town of Reita, which was right near Pressburg, where the Ksav Sofer was the Rav. Later on, the Rav Yehuda Aszod is the rabbi in Szenich. Again, I may be pronouncing all the names of these towns incorrectly. Hungarian town pronunciation is definitely not my strong point, but he was in Szenich for over 20 years. And he had a yeshiva in both of these towns where he served, and he taught in the yeshiva on a regular basis. He was constantly teaching yeshiva students and engaging them. Whoever was not able to obtain kostadje, this teg to eat in the townspeople's homes, he would invite them to eat in his own home. So many of the students ate in the Rosh Yeshiva's home, where his wife would actually cook the meals for many of the yeshiva students. Once, when he was delivering a shir to the local layman in the town, so one of the balabatim posed a question which didn't make any sense. So he tried answering the guy, but he wasn't getting it. So he finally says to him, I think you stole this question from someone else. So the guy is shocked. What does that mean? So Rav Yehuda Aszod clarifies to him. He says, usually you ask such logical questions, such good questions, but this question makes no sense. So I figured you must have taken it from someone else because it's not befitting you. That's how he was able to put him in his place without making him feel bad. In 1853, he returns to his old town of Dunaszerdahely, this time as the rabbi of the town. This is a town in what's today southern Slovakia. That is, Dunaszerdahely is how it's in Hungarian and in Yiddish. That's how Jews refer to it. In German, it was called Niedmarket. In Slovakian, it was referred to as Dunaszerdahely, I think. That's how you pronounce it, something along those lines. Either way, those days it was considered part of Hungary. It still is near the Hungarian border. The population of the town is primarily Hungarian, even though it's in Slovakia. Before the war, there was a prominent Jewish community there since the mid-1700s. It's situated in the heart of Oberland, and with immigrants from Moravia, from that, which the Jews were half the town's population. There was over 200 Jewish families at the time that Rav Yehuda Aszod was the rabbi there. He had a yeshiva there as well, which peaked at 150 students. So it was already a prominent yeshiva in the area. That's all in his rabbinical positions. However, the primary legacy of Rav Yehuda Aszod is his public leadership well beyond the confines of his own community in confronting the challenges facing the Jews of the Austrian Empire in the 19th century. The spectrum of Jewish reactions to the anticipated emancipation that they were to receive from the government of Austria it crossed the whole spectrum. There were the assimilationists, there was the reform, later the neolog, with rabbis promoting it such as Aaron Churin and others, many others, just one example. There's the neo-Orthodox approach, which in Germany was Reb Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, but especially in these areas, it was Reb Ezriel Hildesheimer, who later on was famous in Germany, but when he was still nearby in Eisenstadt for many years. And then there's the old school, middle of the road Orthodox, not middle of the road, they're pretty, not exactly middle of the road, as opposed to the extremists. That's what I mean. We'll see in a second. But people like the Ksav Sofer, the son of the Ksav Sofer, and we'll see soon Rav Yehuda Aszod himself. And then there's the militant or ultra-Orthodox or extreme Orthodox, such as represented by Rav Hillel Lichtenstein, Rav Hillel Kolamaya, who Rav Yehuda Aszod had a very tense relationship with because he was the representative of the extremism of Hungarian Orthodoxy. And it's also emanating from the Ksav Sofer. Rav Hillel Lichtenstein is, of course, a close student of the Ksav Sofer, and he ultimately brings that brand of orthodoxy to Unterland and unifies it with Hungarian Hasidus, and that makes it an interesting combination. The extremist version of the Ksav Sofer Hungarian Orthodoxy, as opposed to the moderate one represented by the Ksav Sofer's own son, the Ksav Sofer. So this Rav Hillel Lichtenstein's version, combined with the Hungarian Hasidus and Unterland, forms what has a long-lasting legacy of what Hungarian Orthodoxy came to be known for. Either way, Rav Yehuda Aszod is placed somewhere in the middle of that, similar to the Ksav Sofer, and he had an interesting relationship with people on the extreme, such as Rav Hillel Lichtenstein. One time they had a conversation, and Rav Yehuda Aszod was losing his patience with Rav Hillel Lichtenstein, and he finally says to him, he says, "Your name is Hillel, but really I should be named Hillel because I need Hillel's patience in order to deal with you." But even when Rav Hillel Lichtenstein went against a rabbi in Pressburg, who was appointed by the Ksav Sofer, who Rav Hillel Lichtenstein felt was too liberal, and it was also a subtle critique on the Ksav Sofer himself for allowing this fellow to speak publicly in German. The Rav Hillel Lichtenstein was actually quite critical in general of the Ksav Sofer. He claimed that the true legacy of the Ksav Sofer was with his students, his extreme students, such as himself, and not with his son, the Ksav Sofer. So he had this dispute. Where is the true legacy of the Ksav Sofer? Which is, of course, an interesting story. What is the true legacy of the Ksav Sofer? It's something that still hasn't been solved, but it already started immediately with the Ksav Sofer's passing among his students and family. Either way, Rav Yehuda Aszod, during this controversy between this rabbi and this appointee of the Ksav Sofer, and Rav Hillel Lichtenstein, so Rav Yehuda Aszod was against opposing Rav Hillel Lichtenstein, meaning censuring him. In other words, saying that you've gone too far, you've gone too extreme. He was against doing that. In other words, keep the peace. Don't make dispute among Orthodox rabbis. That was Rav Yehuda Aszod's position. He said Orthodox rabbis can't afford to criticize each other, because Orthodoxy is on the defensive. They're weak, they're a minority, and therefore they need to present a united front against modernity. By the way, this policy may have unintentionally enhanced the extreme flank in Hungarian Orthodoxy, because the moderates in Rav Yehuda Aszod's position was that the moderates should not oppose the extremists. So when you combine that with Unterland Hasidic faction, then that becomes the most long-lasting legacy of Hungarian religious Jewry until this very day. And this has had a decisive impact on the post-war world. In fact, a similar trend can actually be traced in the early decades of the post-war, where moderate voices were voluntarily self-silenced, and they did not oppose the more extreme positions within the Orthodox community, because they recognized that Orthodoxy was a small defensive minority in the post-war era, attempting to rebuild, and therefore there was a need to close ranks and present a united front to face a common opposition. So that's an interesting side point. Either way, Rav Yehuda Aszod enjoys a close relationship with the much younger Reb Ezriel Hildesheimer, and was in support of his school in Eisenstadt, which taught general subjects as well, and he even sent 2 of his sons to study in that yeshiva. At the same time, he was also opposed to Rav Hildesheimer's plans on opening a rabbinical seminary in the same spirit of having general studies. He was opposed to, Rav Yehuda Aszod was opposed to that plan. So he maintained a very fine balance between neo-orthodoxy and extreme orthodoxy, which is why I refer to it as somewhere in the middle. And even in some of his halachic opinions that was expressed, which were published by his son and successor, he expressed some more, I guess what we would call liberal. I don't know if liberal is the right term for it, but more, reflecting the times than the prevailing developing view in Hungarian Orthodoxy, such as his ruling that wine touched by a non-observant Jew is still kosher. So again, that bit of a middle of a road a path that he was treading. Yet essentially, Rav Yehuda Aszod at the same time, he leads the charge to preserve tradition. He leads the charge to maintain the position of orthodoxy, to oppose the reformist elements, and was the spokesman against change. This was from early on, and especially following the passing of his Rebbe, the Maharam Banet, and the Ksav Sofer. He signs the very famous pamphlet of Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger, the Aruch Laner, which was titled Shloimei Emunei Yisrael in 1830, in opposition to reformist elements. He wrote letters. He led public outcries. He had polemics with many leading figures who were promoting assimilationist policies, reformist policies. He went against specific individuals who were promoting these issues. He wrote a letter decrying rabbis who sanctioned intermarriage, who changed the language and the content of prayer in the synagogues, and the like, and many, many examples of it. This should be seen in the context of attempts at Austrian Jewry, at Hungarian Jewry, at attaining emancipation and equal rights, which they eventually did after the passing of Rav Yehuda Aszod in late 1860s by Franz Jozef. But here they're leading up to it. They're trying to get it. So many reformers and assimilationists are promoting patriotism and loyalty, first to the crown and then to the failed Hungarian revolt in 1848 against the crown, which is also a huge story. And it also leads to the assimilationists and the reform eventually abandoning the German language in favor of Hungarian. So is it Hungarian patriotism, or is it patriotism to the Austrian Empire, which is German? So it's an interesting dilemma as well. Either way, the Orthodox ironically adopt the German. When the assimilationists and reform adopt Hungarian, so the Orthodox drop Yiddish and adopt German, and eventually they transition into Hungarian as well. That's an interesting linguistic tidbit. During this 1848 Hungarian Revolution, it was often dangerous for the Jewish communities because the Hungarians were revolting against the Austrian Empire. It was crushed, the revolt. But the Jews were very often caught in the middle of it all. And in fact, on the night of Pesach, there were rumors of marauding bands roaming the town streets where Rav Yehuda Aszod was the Rav. And there was suspicion that there might be a full-blown pogrom on the way. And many fearful townspeople came for security to the rabbi's home. And when he reached the portion of the Seder in the Haggadah of Shfoich Chamascha, he opens the door, and just as he opens the door, a messenger arrives at his door to relate that the danger had passed. There was no more danger of a pogrom in the area. So he starts to gain a reputation as a miracle worker as well, which is something that would make him quite famous in his later years. Either way, getting back to his public leadership against reform, so Rav Yehuda Aszod sends a letter also to the Beis Din of Nikolsburg after a liberal rabbi was appointed in the town, and he writes in that letter, he decries that he heard that Jews would go to cafes on Shabbos morning in Nikolsburg and read newspapers while drinking coffee prepared by non-Jews. And he felt that such activity was a slippery slope away from tradition and leading to non-observance of Shabbos altogether. He was once asked by a modernist rabbi in Vienna if he could permit a kohen to marry a divorcee, because this kohen, who was no longer observant, was threatening to convert to Christianity if he would not be given a dispensation to marry a divorcee. Rav Yehuda Aszod, of course, firmly forbade it, but you see how he's at the forefront of all this changed. He's involved in basically every high-profile and also many low-profile polemics, disputes, and the like with all sorts of rabbis who are in the process of reforming traditional practices as expressions of patriotism and loyalty and attempts to obtain emancipation, and literally the list is endless. One of his last high-profile meetings was with the Emperor Franz Jozef himself. In 1864, there was a rabbinic conference of Orthodox rabbis to oppose the opening of a reformist rabbinical seminary. So they decided to send a delegation of several rabbis, including the Ksav Sofer, Rav Ezriel Hildesheimer, Rav Yirmiyahu Lev, Rav David Deutsch, and the speaker and the one who's supposed to lead the delegation is Rav Yehuda Aszod, the senior rabbi of Hungarian Jewry at this point. Now on the agenda is the upcoming government approval of this establishment of the reformist-style rabbinical seminary, which the delegation wanted the emperor to rescind his permission, as they, of course, opposed its opening. So they got to meet with him. They actually got to meet the Emperor Franz Jozef himself, and he promised to accommodate them. He did not accommodate them. He just pushed it off. But several years later, it was actually after Rav Yehuda Aszod's passing, and he allowed also at that point the Orthodox to resign from the Jewish communities, from the Kahals, and form their own autonomous community, the famous or the infamous, depending on how you look at it, the Teilung, the separation of the communities in Hungary, which is, of course, a different story. Either way, getting back to the meeting, at the close of this meeting with the emperor, with Franz Josef, he asks the head of the delegation, Rav Yehuda Aszod, to bless him. And he acquiesced, and Rav Yehuda Aszod says to him, and he says to him, you should reign as emperor of the Austrian Empire for many years. That's the blessing he gives. And of course, Franz Josef was emperor for an incredible 67 years and remains one of the longest reigning monarchs in world history. Which brings us to another fascinating facet of the life of Rav Yehuda Aszod. Having no affiliation with the Hasidic movement, Rav Yehuda Aszod was treated almost like a Hasidic Rebbe and miracle worker in his later years. He was proficient in Kabbalah, but he shied away from it publicly, preferred to maintain those practices and study as a private affair. But that's what happened in his later years. Actually, a fascinating story that happened also at his later years. A very strange story, actually, with him and the Ksav Sofer, who he was very close with. There was a rabbinical conference at which the Ksav Sofer, Avram Shmuel Binyamin Sofer, the son of the Chasam Sofer, which he hosted. And he, at one point during this meeting, he shows all his guests what seems to be a genuine silver shekel from the time of the Beis HaMikdash. And he passes it around for all the rabbis to get a view of his precious possession, incredibly old, tangible thing from the second Beis HaMikdash. And during this time, it gets lost. And the Ksav Sofer wants to conduct a search. He wants to do a body search of every rabbi in the room. He's lost his most precious possession, this shekel from the Beis HaMikdash. And Rav Yehuda Aszod protested. He said, it's not respectful to the rabbis present, and it's not respectful to the institution of the rabbinate to search rabbis and suspect them of being a thief. How can you suspect the rabbis, the great rabbanim assembled, that they're a thief? God forbid. And a few minutes later, and the Ksav Sofer backed down. He said, I'm not going to search anyone. A few minutes later, the maid comes in and said, as she was cleaning up the table from all the food, she found it. And there it is. At that point, Rav Yehuda Aszod pulls out of his own pocket also an exact replica, the same thing. And he says, I also have this as a collector's item. I happen to have it as well. A silver shekel from the Beis HaMikdash. And he said, when I saw how excited you were, I didn't want to show it to anyone because you're the host and you were so excited to show it to everyone. But when you wanted to do this search, so then you would suspect me of being a thief. So I tried to, to get you not to do it. And ultimately, they found it and lived happily ever after. He passes away in 1866, and shortly after his passing, the split in Hungarian Jewry takes place between the Orthodox and the Neolog, separate communities. In many ways, this is seen as part of the legacy of Rav Yehuda Aszod, as he had laid the groundwork for this eventual structure, which would be the defining feature of Hungarian Jewry until its demise in the Holocaust. Upon Rav Yehuda Aszod's passing in 1866, besides for the picture that was taken after his passing, but of course also the rabbinical post in Dunaszerdahely was open. 3 years later, his son, Rabbi Shmuel Aszod, who was a student of his father as well as of the Ksav Sofer, was appointed to fill his father's position, and he remained there for the next 36 years until his passing in 1905. So that's a little bit about Rav Yehuda Aszod and his world that he operated in, and his legacy. This is Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, and sponsorships. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites at Podbean or your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoy.